Hello. Today we'll be discussing the influenza epidemic of 1918 in the Southwest, specifically in the state of Arizona. Our group members are Nick, Kim, Kadra, and Sam.
We will discuss 6 different topics that are involved in the epidemic. The 6 are as followed: the major role of World War I, the national response to the epidemic, Arizona's epidemic story, interesting stories about epidemic, uniqueness of the Southwest, and lastly is the public response to the epidemic.
World War I played a key role in the influenza epidemic. The war was between 1914 and 1918. The reason why the war played a key role in the epidemic was because in the spring of 1918, military ships brought the deadly disease to the Americas. Influenza spread in the military from camp to camp throughout the spring and summer of 1918.
When civilians started to get infected, this began a national panic. The public saw influenza as the worst epidemic the country has ever dealt with, even deadlier than World War I. The public feared influenza because people could be fine in the morning and dead by night. And to show this photo is an obituary in Chicago from November 3rd.
Hundreds of thousands of people were getting sick and dying, and this caused a new concern with a shortage of medical staff. The recruitment of women to become nurses became the major response for this concern. This recruitment was aimed towards retired nurses, nurses in the private industry, and women willing to help.
With the lack of medical staff, there was a lot of emphasis put on the public to take prevention methods to stop the spread of influenza. This ad was posted in New York, which shows them telling the public to do the 3 C's of clean mouth, skin, and clothes. They believed this to work because they believed the disease was spread through the air.
In order to understand the state as a whole, let's first look at a particular area in Arizona, Tucson. The Spanish influenza first started to appear in the state of Arizona, particularly Tucson, in early October 1918. This appearance would lead to a series of regulations that would impact the state for months to come.
On October 10, 1918, 24 cases of influenza were reported in the city of Tucson. The mayor of Tucson, O.C. Parker, issued an order closing the schools, churches, theaters, and all other places where people congregate in the city. A week later, the number of cases spiked up, with 120 cases being reported at the University of Arizona alone, and makeshift hospitals were set up for the sick.
A month later, on November 15th, the state fairs of Phoenix, Prescott, and Tucson were all canceled. The Indian Fair in Sacaton would also be canceled on the same day. This indicated that the disease was not just isolated in one city, but that many individuals are being impacted across different parts of the state.
On November 17, 1918, Dr. Meade Klein decided that masks should be worn in any place where people meet for the transaction of necessary business. This would later be changed to everyone being required to wear masks covering the nose and mouth at all times in public.
On December 1st, 1918, it was decided that the quarantine of businesses from influenza would be lifted, but masks were still to be worn by the entire citizenry. Only schools were exempt from the order due to the spacing of the seating arrangements and the children's biology supposedly preventing the spread of disease.
Following an increase in force of the masking ordinance, 8 people were found guilty of not following the masking ordinance on December 17, 1918. The following day, a banker by the name of John Meats was arrested for not following the ordinance. In his appeal, he angrily expressed how other eastern cities did not follow the same ordinance, bringing into question the usefulness of masks in Tucson.
In the end, on December 21st, 1918, Judge Patty of Tucson decided that the enforcement of wearing masks was invalid because it represented class legislation. Considering school children were exempt from the masking order, it invalidated the ordinance overall. By Christmas Day, hardly anyone in the city was wearing a mask in public. Influenza would not return to the city of Tucson.
Beyond just Tucson, other places in the state were also impacted, as mentioned earlier. From as far south as Nogales to as far north as Flagstaff, and all the way to the Navajo Reservation of the West, influenza was present. Here we see a school reopening in Flagstaff in January 1919, illustrating that all places of Arizona got hit by influenza, not just Tucson. Throughout the time of the influenza epidemic in Arizona, there were a great deal of interesting stories that occurred. In November of 1918, counties in Arizona were commandeering bootleg whiskey and giving it to patients. This picture is an advertisement for black and white Scotch whiskey stating the medicinal qualities of this product. This was considered a turning point of the influenza epidemic.
Newspapers report that the flu had detrimental effects on people, including insanity. An Indian man killed his wife and children with an axe and then proceeded to commit suicide by hanging himself with a meat hook. It was believed he did this because of negative effects the flu was having on the population.
While the flu was widespread around the United States, the epidemic of Arizona was important in the Southwest. Arizona was one of the first places to reach an epidemic level of the flu. Arizona, along with other southwestern states, prepared to mobilize their doctors and have them travel to treat others, stating that they were willing as a patriotic duty to serve in any of these states during the present epidemic of influenza. The flu caused a great deal of public response among the population of Arizona.
The Santa Fe Railroad helped bring the Spanish influenza to Arizona in October of 1918. Holbrook, Winslow, Flagstaff, Williams, Ash Fork, and Seligman had some of the first reports of the influenza, but soon the Santa Fe Railroad would lead the disease to Prescott and Jerome. In 1 week, the disease was reported statewide.
Soldiers who had been transported from Camp Dodge, Iowa on October 2, 1918, died 8 days later at Camp Whipple in Prescott, Arizona. Soldiers traveling to inner-city Prescott on days off came back to base camp seemingly sicker than before. This convinced officers that it was civilians to blame for spreading the disease to the soldiers, though it was in fact the soldiers carrying the disease into the state. The soldiers were put under quarantine due to an increase of cases, but the officers were still allowed to travel as they wished.
When influenza hit Arizona, many news outlets did as much as they could to tone down the seriousness of the disease. Even as public entertainment centers shut down, the newspapers at the time strategically reported that the influenza affecting the state of Arizona was not nearly as bad as the one affecting the East Coast. For over 2 weeks, papers reported that there was no pandemic in the state and not to worry.
With little coverage of the Navajo population, little is known of how it affected this tribe during the epidemic of 1918. What is known is that over 2,000 Navajo on the four corners of Arizona died from the influenza from 1918 to 1919.
The state soon sent out orders to wear masks in public at all times, with emphasis still on not to worry about disease. It seemed that the Arizona government during the time made it seem like covering your face would help our soldiers stay healthy and strong.
The Spanish influenza was very scary for many people because it affected everyone, not just the old, weak, or poor. Even the healthiest of immune systems were affected and quickly killed by the disease. Seemingly healthy teenagers to mid-40-year-olds were at the greatest risk of the disease and were the most affected during this epidemic.
As the Spanish influenza began to cross the state, the public's small concern grew into anxiety that eventually turned to an all-out panic. Soon, stricter steps were being taken by higher officials and schools began closing and wouldn't reopen for months. Public events were being canceled, and many began to flee cities, taking to more private and secure locations away from the disease.